It all began in a quiet neighborhood that prided itself on order and uniformity. Every lawn was clipped to the same precise length, every driveway spotless, every porch light identical. Behind that facade of perfection, though, lurked something darker. This wasn't a simple homeowners association. It was a regime. At least, that's how it felt to anyone who dared step even slightly outside the rigid lines drawn by the board. The neighborhood had its own so-called HOA Police, a group of self-appointed enforcers who patrolled the streets in golf carts with flashing lights. They carried clipboards like badges of authority, snapping pictures of trash bins set out a few minutes too early, measuring fence posts with rulers, and threatening fines with the certainty of real officers. To most residents, they were a nuisance. To some, they were a genuine threat. For years, the neighborhood tolerated them. Some even welcomed their presence, convincing themselves that strict order meant safety. But for one family, this illusion would shatter violently. The trouble began with something almost laughably small, a mailbox. My wife had repainted ours, giving it a fresh coat of matte black with subtle gold trim. It was tasteful, clean, even elegant, but not identical to the standard issue white that the HOA mandated. The difference was obvious to the police patrol, and they didn't waste a second in circling our home like vultures. Notes appeared taped to our door. Citations filled the mailbox itself, and warnings escalated into threats of fines. At first, my wife shrugged it off. She wasn't the kind to flinch at petty authority. What I didn't realize then was how far the HOA police were willing to go. On a late summer evening, when the air was thick and the cicadas droned in the trees, my wife stepped out onto the porch with a glass of water. The sun had just dipped below the rooftops, and the shadows stretched long across the street. That's when a golf cart came screeching to a halt at the curb. Two men jumped out, one clutching a clipboard, the other resting his hand on something tucked beneath his vest. The first barked questions about the mailbox. The second kept his eyes fixed on her, his hand never leaving that concealed shape. To any other resident, it might have looked like intimidation. To my wife, trained eyes immediately recognized the outline of a firearm. What he did next crossed every line. He pulled it. A pistol, gleaming under the last rays of daylight, leveled at her chest. The neighborhood was silent. A dog barked once in the distance, then fell quiet. From behind drawn curtains, blinds tilted ever so slightly, eyes peered out. But no one stepped forward. No one shouted for reason. The HOA police had become feared enough that even neighbors stayed frozen in their own homes. My wife didn't move, though not from fear. There was no tremor in her hands, no gasp of shock. She had faced weapons before. What this man didn't know, what no one in that neighborhood knew, was that my wife wasn't an ordinary suburban resident. She wasn't just a spouse quietly tending to her home. She was Delta Force, not retired, not a veteran long past her days of service. She was still active. Still sharp, still dangerous. But to him, she looked like any other woman who might crumble under the weight of a weapon pointed at her. He mistook calm for submission. That mistake would change everything. When I arrived home minutes later, the golf cart was gone, the street empty, and my wife sitting calmly on the porch as though nothing had happened. I noticed the faint smudge of powder on the step, the mark of a boot print pressed too firmly into the dirt. She didn't tell me everything at first, only that there had been an incident. But her eyes, steady and unflinching, carried more weight than her words. Later that night, as she locked the door and double-checked the windows, I understood. The HOA police had gone too far. What had started with petty citations had escalated into something much more dangerous. They weren't just bullies with clipboards anymore. They were armed. And they had just aimed a gun at the wrong person. What the HOA police thought would be an act of intimidation had instead lit a fuse. My wife wasn't about to let it slide, and as much as I wanted to believe this was the end of it, a single incident to be reported and forgotten, deep down, I knew. This was just the beginning. The board, the self-appointed enforcers, the entire culture of control that had consumed this neighborhood, it was about to face a storm they had no idea how to withstand. Because when you pull a gun on a Delta Force operator, you don't just threaten their safety, you declare war. And this war was about to begin. The morning after the gun incident, the neighborhood seemed to move in slow motion. Sprinklers hissed on automatic timers, joggers kept their usual routes, and delivery trucks rumbled by. On the surface, nothing had changed. But beneath the ordinary rhythm of suburbia, tension rippled like a current. My wife was up before dawn, her movements precise, controlled. She sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee, her posture rigid, her gaze locked on the street through the open blinds. To anyone else, it looked like she was simply staring out at the world waking up. I knew better. She was studying it, memorizing patterns, noting vehicles, cataloging every unfamiliar face. Old habits don't die, especially not for someone like her. The HOA police made no appearance that morning, though I spotted their golf carts twice on my way to work. They slowed in front of our house but didn't stop, almost as though they were waiting for us to react. It was a dance of intimidation, but the silence was louder than any words they could have thrown our way. By mid-afternoon, the first formal notice arrived. Slid neatly under the door, stamped with the HOA letterhead, it accused us of threatening behavior toward board representatives. It was absurd. They had pulled a gun, yet somehow we were painted as the aggressors. The message was clear. The HOA board wasn't just aware of what happened, they were trying to rewrite it. That evening, we walked the block. Neighbors peeked out nervously, some offering tight-lipped nods, others avoiding eye contact altogether. Fear clung to the air. A few whispered words confirmed what we already suspected. This wasn't the first time the so-called HOA police had pushed too far. They had barged into garages, confiscated bicycles they claimed violated storage rules, and even threatened fines over political signs on private property. But until now, no one had dared push back. The board held their power through intimidation. The police were their muscle, and the residents, caught in the middle, had convinced themselves submission was the only way to survive. But my wife wasn't built for submission. She began preparing quietly, not with anger, but with precision. She gathered information, documented every notice, every interaction, every moment of surveillance. She tracked their golf cart routes, logged timestamps of when they lingered at our property, and even collected statements from the few brave enough to speak. It wasn't revenge she was plotting. It was control, the kind that can only come from patience and knowledge. Still, the board escalated. 2 nights later, floodlights were mounted across the street, angled directly at our home. Their glow pierced through our curtains, flooding the bedroom with harsh white light. It wasn't about safety, it was harassment, plain and simple. The HOA police circled every hour, their tires crunching on gravel, engines humming in the quiet night. On the 3rd day, the threats turned public. Notices were pinned on the neighborhood bulletin board, accusing us of destabilizing the community. Our names were written in bold, our address listed below. Neighbors were urged to report any suspicious activity connected to our property. The board had turned us into villains, scapegoats for anyone willing to believe their narrative. But while they pushed harder, my wife never flinched. She adjusted, adapted, as though every move they made was expected. Watching her was like witnessing a chess master play against amateurs who didn't realize they were already losing. Late that week, an opportunity presented itself. One of the HOA police, an older man with a habit of smoking near the community pool, slipped. He spoke too loudly on a phone call, unaware my wife was within earshot. She pieced together enough to know the board wasn't acting alone. They had insurance in place, a legal safety net designed to shield them from liability should their officers ever go too far. That explained their boldness. They believed they were untouchable. But arrogance always leaves cracks. The more the HOA flexed their control, the more residents began to notice. Quiet resentment, once buried under fear, started surfacing in hushed conversations. Parents complained about their children being scolded for sidewalk chalk drawings. Elderly couples whispered about threats to remove porch furniture that didn't meet guidelines. The longer the spotlight stayed on us, the more people began questioning the system itself. My wife wasn't just enduring their attacks, she was shifting the balance. Their overreach was exposing them. Still, danger loomed. The memory of that gun remained fresh, an unspoken reminder that these weren't harmless bullies. They had crossed into violence once, and they could do it again. Every time a golf cart slowed in front of our house, I wondered if another weapon was hidden under a vest, waiting for the next moment of escalation. By the end of the week, the board called an emergency meeting. Flyers announced it as a community discussion to address disruptive elements. We both knew who they meant. This wasn't a meeting, it was a trial, and the verdict had already been written. But if the board thought they could corner us in front of the neighborhood, they hadn't counted on my wife's quiet strength. She wasn't planning to shout or argue. She didn't need to. She had something far more powerful than their accusations. She had the truth, and the patience to deliver it at exactly the right moment. The neighborhood was on edge, the board restless, the HOA police circling like predators convinced they were still in control. But control was slipping. Every action they took tightened the noose they had unknowingly tied around themselves. The storm hadn't broken yet, but it was close. And when it did, no one in that boardroom would walk away the same. The night of the emergency HOA meeting, the air in the community center was thick with unease. Folding chairs were lined in neat rows beneath buzzing fluorescent lights. A long table stood at the front of the room, where the board members had already stationed themselves like judges presiding over a trial. The HOA police flanked the sides of the room, clipboards in hand, uniforms pressed crisp as though this were some kind of official proceeding. The turnout was larger than expected. Residents filled nearly every chair, some curious, others anxious. Whispers ran through the crowd, rising and falling like waves before a storm. Everyone knew why they were there. The flyers had made sure of that. This wasn't about neighborhood bylaws or landscaping. This was about us. My wife walked in calmly, her presence quiet but commanding. She didn't look like someone under scrutiny. She looked like someone in control of herself, and that alone unsettled the board. I followed behind, feeling every pair of eyes turn as we made our way to the back of the room. The board chair opened the meeting with stiff formality, speaking of community values, safety concerns, and threats to harmony. Each phrase was crafted to sound reasonable, but the undertone was clear. They were painting us as a danger. Accusations followed. A board member read from a sheet of paper, listing supposed infractions, a non-compliant mailbox, uncooperative responses to citations, aggressive behavior toward enforcement officers. The words carried weight, not because they were true, but because they were spoken with authority. To most, authority was enough. But this time, not everyone was convinced. A murmur spread through the crowd. Parents exchanged glances. Elderly couples shook their heads. The overreach had been growing too obvious, and now in this very room it was being laid bare. When the accusations ended, the chair invited community input. It wasn't meant as a genuine opportunity. It was theater. They expected silence, or perhaps a few voices of agreement. Instead, hesitation broke into something else. A father stood, his voice steady but low. He spoke of how his children had been reprimanded for sidewalk chalk. A woman described her porch swing being tagged for removal. An older man mentioned the repeated fines over the shade of paint on his shutters. Each story was small on its own, but together they painted a picture that no longer matched the board's narrative. For the first time, the board looked unsettled. The HOA police shifted uneasily, clipboards clutched tighter, as if paper and pens could reassert their control. And then my wife rose. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The room fell silent the moment she began speaking. She described the night a gun was drawn on her, not with drama, but with precision. Every detail was laid out. The weapon, the officer, the silence of neighbors who had watched through curtains. She didn't accuse. She reported. Her calm delivery made the truth impossible to dismiss. Gasps rippled through the room. Shocked faces turned toward the board. Some neighbors whispered, others leaned forward, their skepticism crumbling under the weight of her testimony. The chair tried to dismiss her words, waving them off as exaggeration, but the room was no longer with him. My wife reached into a folder she had carried in, pulling out documentation she had quietly gathered over the past week, timestamps, photos, witness accounts. Evidence, neat and undeniable. She didn't throw it at them. She placed it gently on the table, as if she were giving them one last chance to confront reality. The silence that followed was crushing. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting toward the HOA police. The officers stood rigid, but their confidence had cracked. The illusion of authority, so carefully maintained, was unraveling. And then something unexpected happened. A resident from the front row stood and demanded answers. Another followed. Soon voices rose from across the room, questions fired at the board with a force they weren't prepared to handle. Why were weapons being carried by people with no legal authority? Why were residents being targeted over trivialities? Who had given the HOA police the right to act like law enforcement? The board stammered, their responses stumbling, defensive. For every excuse they offered, my wife countered with fact. For every attempt to redirect blame, another resident spoke up with their own story. The meeting, once staged to condemn us, had transformed into something else entirely. By the end, the board had lost control. Their gavel strikes meant nothing against the rising tide of voices. The HOA police, once feared, stood mute in the corner, their presence no longer intimidating but absurd. When the meeting adjourned, it wasn't with resolution, but with fracture. The crowd dispersed in groups, whispering, plotting, emboldened. The neighborhood had seen too much to return to blind compliance. Yet beneath the small victory, danger lingered. The board was wounded, embarrassed in front of the very people they ruled. And wounded authority rarely retreats quietly. It lashes out. That night, as we walked back to our house under the dim glow of streetlights, my wife said nothing. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes told me she was ready. The board might strike back. The HOA police might escalate again, but she wasn't afraid. She had faced worse than this, in places far from suburban lawns and manicured hedges. And she knew one thing with certainty: the fight wasn't over. The board had lost their grip on the neighborhood. Now, in desperation, they would try to regain it. And when they did, they would find themselves against someone far more dangerous than they could imagine. The days following the meeting were restless. The neighborhood had changed. Conversations no longer stopped when the HOA police carts rolled by. Curtains no longer snapped shut as the enforcers patrolled. Something had shifted. Residents had seen the truth, and fear was losing its grip. But the board wasn't ready to surrender. Power once tasted isn't easily given up. Their retaliation began with silence. Notices ceased, patrols slowed, and the bulletin board remained empty. On the surface, it looked like they had retreated, but silence can be more dangerous than noise. My wife saw it for what it was: regrouping. They hadn't abandoned their grip. They were preparing for a strike. It came late one night. The street was quiet, every house lit dimly by porch lights. I woke to the crunch of gravel outside, faint but deliberate. My wife was already at the window, her posture alert. 3 golf carts idled at the curb, engines low, lights off. Figures moved across our lawn, shadows with flashlights cutting thin beams through the dark. They weren't delivering notices. They weren't taking photos. They were advancing. The sound of metal scraping against our lock sent a chill through me. They were trying to force their way in. These weren't neighbors acting on community bylaws. These were men emboldened by false authority, willing to cross into outright crime to preserve their control. But they had chosen the wrong house. Before they could breach the door, it swung open. My wife stood framed in the porch light, calm as stone. The intruders froze, their flashlights quivering in their hands. For the second time, a weapon appeared. One of the HOA police, the same man who had drawn on her before, now aiming his pistol with reckless hands. What happened next unfolded faster than I could process. My wife moved with a precision born from years of training. Her hand struck his wrist, the weapon clattering to the ground before he could react. In the same motion, she stepped forward, using his own momentum to drive him backward into the others. Flashlights spilled across the lawn as they scrambled, stumbling under the weight of their own arrogance. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to freeze them where they stood. And then headlights appeared at the end of the street. Multiple cars speeding in with urgency, tires screeching to a halt. It wasn't backup for the HOA police. It was the real police called by neighbors who had finally found their voices. Residents had witnessed the break-in, heard the scuffle, and acted where fear had once kept them silent. What followed was chaos. Officers swarmed the lawn, shouts cutting through the night. The so-called HOA police were handcuffed, their clipboards scattered in the grass like discarded toys. The man who had drawn his weapon once again was pinned face down, his false authority stripped away in an instant. The board members, too, were exposed. The investigation revealed how they had armed their enforcers, funded them through misused HOA fees, and shielded themselves with fraudulent insurance claims. The system they had built, one of intimidation and control, collapsed under the weight of its corruption. Neighbors gathered in the days that followed, not in fear but in unity. Stories poured out, years of silent frustration finally spoken aloud. The community realized what they should have known all along. The HOA had no real power beyond what residents allowed. And now, with its leaders disgraced and its police disbanded, the neighborhood breathed free for the first time in years. Through it all, my wife remained steady. She never boasted, never reveled in the downfall of those who had tried to break us. She carried herself with the same quiet resolve that had defined her from the beginning. To her, this wasn't about victory. It was about restoring balance, about ensuring that no one else in this neighborhood would ever face a gun for painting a mailbox. The board was dissolved, replaced by a modest council of volunteers who sought cooperation rather than domination. The golf carts were sold off, their flashing lights dismantled. The community center, once a place of intimidation, became a gathering spot for barbecues, block parties, and late-night conversations under warm string lights. Life returned to normal, or at least as normal as suburbia could be. Lawns grew a little less uniform. Porch swings creaked again. Sidewalk chalk bloomed in color across driveways, unchallenged and celebrated. And though the scars of fear lingered, they served as reminders of what happens when people forget their own strength. For me, the image that endures is my wife, standing calm and unshaken as false authority tried to break into our home. The neighborhood had seen a side of her that night they would never forget, a strength forged far beyond these quiet streets, brought home to defend not just her family, but everyone who had been too afraid to fight back. The HOA police thought they could rule through fear. They didn't realize fear doesn't last forever, and they certainly didn't realize who they were pointing their guns at. If you enjoyed this story and want more wild HOA and Karen drama, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss the next one.